Right, so the topic of why music, or the question of why music is able to induce such rich emotions in listeners is one that's really fascinated psychologists and neuroscientists for a long time. In fact, it's fascinated philosophers for even longer. In fact, there isn't any one strict definition of emotion in psychology. It's a bit of a bugbear, but most researchers agree that it basically involves a number of key components. So it involves a so-called cognitive component, which is to do with you evaluating a situation, a context, an event. There's a psychophysiological component, which is basically talking about the fact that your autonomic nervous system may show changes as a result of being in this emotional state. So your heart rate may change, your breathing rate may change, so your automatic nervous system. And there's meant to be a sort of expressive, behavioral, I've kind of packing them together, component where, if you're scared, your face will show terror. If you're angry, you'll similarly have a very distinctive expression on your face. And like I said, behavior. So you might also, act in a certain way in certain emotional states. So there's this idea that, you express and you behave in it shows you that you're in an emotional state. And finally, there's the feeling component, and this is probably what most of us in everyday life, think about when we think about emotion. It's like I feel sad, or it's the subjective report, the subjective experience of the person experiencing an emotion. What we know is that emotions include all of these components. What we then mean by music-induced emotions are emotional states that are induced by, listening to music, and which necessarily have a few of these components. We emphasize the induced because we want to emphasize the fact that it's felt in response to music as opposed to perceived, as opposed to us perceiving something in the music. And this is an important distinction to make because often we'll maybe perceive a music as happy, but it doesn't necessarily make us happy. And so this is an important distinction to make, and one that researchers really care about when they look at music-induced emotions. Why would we want to study them? Well, because research suggests actually that about half of our music listening episodes involve some sort of emotion. So one could argue that if you want to get a holistic understanding of emotions in general, it's useful to sort of get a grip, or at least better understand this part of our emotional lives. So when considering music-induced emotions, it's important to also consider how psychologists have, talked about emotions in general. So there are two very popular models, and it's almost naughty to repeat it because that's sort of the one the psychologists repeat every single time. It's probably not news to anyone who cares a little bit about psychology, but basically it's the basic model, which is just basically that we have these innate universal emotions happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, surprise. And the idea is that across, the world, you'll see people be able to recognize these emotions. This is what makes them so universal and basic. But the question is, how well can they actually account for music-induced emotions? So maybe sometimes you feel happy when you listen to music. It makes you, or you feel sad. Somehow you feel a bit more, sad. But how often do you feel angry or disgusted? Not often. So the question is whether that would be a good way to think about music-induced emotions. Probably not. Or not alone. Another very key model is that of the dimensional model of emotions, and that simply says 2 to 3 dimensions are enough to describe most emotion states. So the one dimension is valence, which is basically how pleasant, something is, how it feels. And then there's arousal, and it could be tension and energy, or just plain arousal. But the idea is it sort of is an indication of your sort of the state of your autonomic nervous system, again, how heart rate, breathing rate, that sort of thing. But again, we could say, well, yes, that could, help me tell you about how I feel about the music right now. I feel it's very nice. I feel quite, calm as opposed to, aroused. But again, how much nuance is that in terms of describing what happens when we listen to music? And so what researchers of music psychology have decided is that these are interesting and useful, but not enough. And the trend has been to try to see if we can capture or acknowledge the wide variety of emotions that may be induced by music, and really emphasize the fact that perhaps they aren't the sort of utilitarian emotions that we experience in everyday life. Now, utilitarian emotions are meant to be those emotions that help us adapt or adjust to events that are important to our survival and well-being. Fear, you have to run away from, the thing that's fearful. often there's no real critical consequences of what we're hearing when we're listening to music. Basically, it's just the form that we're enjoying and reflecting on. And so the idea is that actually with music-induced emotions, these are specific emotions that are of a sort of non-utilitarian nature that are sort of removed from self-concerns. And with that, researchers have gone out and said, well, how can we find out what these are? And they've gone to concerts outside of festivals and just asked people, what did you experience while you were in there? And then you try to see if there are any patterns in what people keep repeating, as the emotions they felt. And what's interesting is you find emotions like nostalgia or tenderness, and you'll have something that's close to happiness, like joyful activation has been put forward, for instance. But the idea is that you don't necessarily see the sorts of things we see with the basic emotions. Another interesting trend, actually, that you see in music psychology research on the topic of induced emotions is that people are now stressing not just what emotions you can have, but how they come about, so the mechanisms underlying them. And indeed, one influential paper, for instance, suggested there's about 8 of them. And what I'd like to do is just mention a couple. One of them is, one of these mechanisms is musical expectancy. And this is just the idea that, especially in the case of tonal music, so music that follows these rules, you tend to make predictions about what's going to happen next. We can't help it. It's also the way our brain is structured. And so, of course, when you make predictions, sometimes you'll get it right, sometimes you'll get it wrong, sometimes you'll have to wait to find out what the outcome is. And what we've seen is that people generally enjoy this whole sort of predictive process. And what's more, when you are surprised, when you got it wrong, you have a very distinctive pattern of brain activity that's kind of cares about getting things wrong, and actually physiological arousal. We also see changes in physiological arousal when people get it wrong. So we see that actually this is a real mechanism by which emotions are being induced, or some sort of emotion is being induced by music. Another mechanism is empathy. So now perhaps most of us think of empathy as something quite social. I empathize with someone. But it's really it's really quite interesting for most people when they find out, people who care about the psychology of aesthetics or music, and emotions, etc., to find out that actually the word empathy came into the English dictionary through the word Einfühlung, which means feel into, and it was all about how we respond to art. And so it's quite interesting to see that empathy is something that actually is now recognized as the way in which emotions are induced in us through art and music, for example, but it was also what people were thinking in those days. And what's interesting is we've seen studies that show, for instance, just generally how empathetic you are in everyday life. If you're just someone who empathizes a lot, this is able to predict the extent to which you'll be moved by sad music, for instance. So you hear a sad song and you'll say, oh gosh, I'm so moved. And it's because perhaps you're empathizing with what you seem to think is the story behind that. Similarly, we've seen that if another type of empathy is not sort of very emotional, but rather a bit more cognitive. So it's a weird thing, it's cognitive empathy. And what people have shown, for instance, is that when you're listening to music that you think has been composed by a real person, or compared to when you think it's been composed by an algorithm, a whole brain network that cares about attributing mental states to other people, reading their mind almost, lights up, suggesting that, again, when we listen to music, we can't help but sort of wonder or reflect on what, they might be trying to tell us, or just mental states that perhaps they were in. The work I do, I guess, is sort of more on the brain side. So I care about how the brain's emotion network, areas that we know to be involved in processing emotions, mediating emotions, how they are modulated by simple things like consonance and dissonance, or the surprise that we feel in response to music. And I carry out this research sometimes with a very unique sample of participants, which are people who have to have intracranial electrodes in their brain. So normally we just measure from the scalp, psychology students too often, but sometimes we have access to patients who are willing to take part in our experiments who just happen to have electrodes in their brain for surgical procedures that they're about to carry out. And with that sort of data, we can really get some very fine temporal resolution on brain areas that are that we know they're very deep in the brain. and that we know to be involved in emotions. So that's been sort of some of my research. But in that case, I've tended to use very simple stimuli, the idea being that it's a very rich data set to use simple stimuli if you can. Of course, we want ecological validity. So in other studies, we've asked people to come into the lab with their own music, and then we've asked questions like, bring in music that, there are moments where you find moments really beautiful, and then we've studied how they describe those moments, how they respond physiologically to those moments, and actually what's happening in the music in those moments. And we've seen some very interesting patterns in terms of sometimes these moments are very arousing, and we see that they report them being very arousing, and then we see that in fact their bodily responses reflect that, and we also see in the music that there are clear structural changes at those moments. And then we have others where they report being very calm, and interestingly we don't see any huge structural changes. If anything, we just see increased smiling, which we think has something to do with the fact that actually it's so easy to process, and somehow they're seeing the beauty in that ease or sort of processing fluency. And so in those sorts of studies, we're moving away from sort of looking at the fundamentals of features of music to sort of looking at the more emphasis on the experience and trying to understand, emotions and what we hope is similar to what are experienced in everyday life.